The Oka Crisis, also known as the Kanesatake Resistance, was the result of hundreds of years of mistreatment toward the Mohawk people by the Canadian government. Since the 18th century, the Mohawk have been attempting to gain recognition of their land in what's now known as the province of Quebec. According to an analysis by the Globe and Mail, having their claim rejected multiple times by the Canadian government has taken a toll, and the Mohawk people have no legal say in any government-planned projects on their land. In 1989, the town of Oka planned to expand an already existing golf course and build a townhouse complex on Kanesatake burial grounds. The area in question is known as the Pines. The announcement of this plan led to many months of protests from the Mohawk, who deeply value the land in which their ancestors are buried. In order to prevent construction workers from entering, the Kanesatake people created roadblocks blocking all the entrances to the Pines. Their goal was to stop development until the 24th of September, where Canadian Parliament would resume, when they hoped they would be able to begin negotiations. The Quebec government, however, disagreed with the Mohawks, employing provincial officers to take down the barricades by force. Following the death of a Quebec Special Forces officer, the Canadian Armed Forces became involved. It was not until Canadian Parliament promised to meet the demands of the Kanesatake people that the protests finally came to an end. The aftermath was the federal government purchasing the land on which the development was planned to take place, temporarily preventing development from happening. To this day, the disputed land is still owned by the federal government, with no plans to transfer the land to the Kanesatake people. Still highly debated today is whether the Canadian government really learned anything from the Oka Crisis. Still today, Quebec's provincial police force and the Canadian Armed Forces have declined all interviews from all media. While the army originally accommodated the media, they eventually cut off journalists' cell service on the 17th of September 1990 and heavily controlled journalists who were entering and exiting the Pines. All that can be analyzed today is the resulting actions from the provincial and federal governments and how they may correlate with the events that took place in Oka. While some argue that not much has changed, the protest from the Wet'suwet'en people in British Columbia in 2020 against a potential pipeline being constructed on their land could be an indication that something has changed. Following negotiations with the federal government, the situation was diffused, and protesters dispersed without significant violence or injuries. On the other hand, the Oka Crisis is extremely significant to Indigenous people to this day. It is still heavily debated among the Kanesatake people whether blockades are the most effective method for letting their voices be heard. Louis Stacy, a Mohawk from Kanesatake, partially agrees with the idea of blockades, stating that they can be effective, but that they can also hurt the protesters. While support for Indigenous rights is more rampant than ever, many Indigenous people, as well as Mark Miller, the Federal Indigenous Services Minister, agree that taking a stand against unfair treatment is the right course of action to take. However, violence of any sort is unacceptable, and Miller says that it is more impactful to take a peaceful stand against injustice. All in all, the Mohawk agree to this day that the Oka Crisis was a conflict that had no winner, despite it being a conflict that was necessary. The most important takeaway, however, is that there is a common consensus among the Kanesatake people that if the same situation were to arise, they would have no other choice but to take the same approach against injustice. Adding to the uncertainty is Brian Mulroney's letter following the Oka Crisis. Mulroney was the Canadian Prime Minister at the time, and he stated, quote, "The federal government is determined to create a new relationship among Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians based on dignity, trust, and respect, and that he will address the concerns of Canada's Aboriginal peoples in contemporary Canadian life." However, according to the APTN, it is still up to debate whether any of Mulroney's promises have been kept by Mulroney's successors. Although media reports on the Oka Crisis were mainly focused on the Canadian governmental response as well as the Mohawk resistance, certain groups who were not initially involved began to exercise a response to the ongoing crisis. The public took two main sides. On one side, there were Quebec residents who were angry at the blockades fabricated by the Mohawk. Most notably, this anger resulted in cars being vandalized and protesters being attacked on their way out of the Pines. On the other hand, there were many people who were supportive of the Mohawk resistance. Support came in many forms, including groups of supporters across Canada creating blockades on main railways in support of the Mohawk. The Oka Crisis was the culmination of a years-long conflict between the Mohawk people and the Canadian government. While the events that took place are unfortunate, there were certain positive effects resulting from the crisis that are still seen to this day. For instance, provincial and federal governments in Canada have become more considerate of First Nations people, many times consulting the involved people as a courtesy before proceeding with potential development. All in all, the Oka Crisis brings about a burning question, and that is enough being done about the highly debated topic of Indigenous rights, and will we ever reach a point where all parties involved are satisfied?